Violent crime rates are surging. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The National Post put out an article titled Canadian Murder Rate Reaches New Highs, and it's mainly due to gang violence. So, there's been nearly 20 years of progress on the Canadian violent crime front, and that's effectively been erased as the country emerged from COVID-19. The homicide rate is worse than any time since the mid-2000s. Now, that itself is quite interesting. Worse than any period since the mid-2000s. Obviously, we're backtracking in this country when it comes to violent crime, and many would say that the pandemic created an environment where crime could surge, given the tough situations that it gave rise to in this country. But keep in mind, too, we are saying that at this current point in time, we're worse than the mid-2000s, and the mid-2000s also had harsh circumstances, like the '08 financial crisis. So what's the current situation? Well, a total of 788 people were murdered in Canada in 2021, and that's according to Stats Canada. Nearly a quarter of those murders were gang-related, and that's the highest raw number of gang-related homicides that the federal government has ever seen, dating back to when it started tracking it in 2005. Now, an alternate headline there is that 75% of murders in Canada are not gang-related. And that's also quite alarming. Those are people who are not affiliated with violent groups who are still getting caught up in a rise in murder rate. Then the other headline that the article is pushing is also quite alarming, that gang violence is rising in Canada, and it's supposedly at the highest level that's ever been since the country started tracking it. And since murders rarely escape, according to the article, the attention of law enforcement, they are generally considered the most accurate gauge of violent crime trends. And what that means is there are other forms of violent crime, but many of them often go unnoticed or unreported or unresolved, things like that. But it's hard to do that with murder, as somebody has died and there's a dead body here that we have to look into. So when things like homicide rate go up, generally that's an indicator that violent crime and even crime at large is also on the upswing. A country in which homicide is going up also becomes a breeding ground for other types of crime. Typically, homicide is paired with something else, whether that's homicide and theft, homicide and gang violence, homicide and whatever. Of course, there is the accidental manslaughter, but that's not what's driving this trend up. And for someone to kill another person with intent, usually there is further reasoning behind that. Now, we do have to put things in perspective, though. Canada is far from the worst, obviously. Canada's murder rate is still well below the peaks that it had throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. So, the murder rate is not the worst that we've ever seen. Now, the gang-related violence, though, that is the worst we've seen since we started recording it. The country's 2021 homicide rate was about 2.06 per 100,000, so still very rare. Although it is rising and you should be aware of that, it's still very unlikely that it happens to you. And for comparison, in 1975, it was about 3.02 per 100,000, meaning that the odds of being a victim of homicide were about 50% more likely back then than they are today. And given that Canada's population continues to grow, even though 2021, as we talked about, yielded the largest raw number of homicides and homicides related to gang violence, it also could just be a function of there being more people here. That's why the per capita or per 100,000 metric is valuable, to put things in perspective. Now, for further comparison, Canada does have a homicide rate that is roughly twice that of the UK or France and quadruple that of Italy. So, although things are not as bad as they could be, they certainly could be a lot better too. And if you compare us to our neighbors down south, we're doing better than America, that's for sure, and definitely better than the global average. The average homicide rate around the world is roughly 3 times that of Canada. So it depends who you're comparing us to. We're certainly closer to the top of the pack, but compared to countries that are exceedingly safe, there's still a lot of room that we can use to improve on. Now, to get to the cause and effects of the situation, we have to call out the political silence here. Politicians are very quiet when it comes to this matter, because these things are happening on their current watch. Who's to blame for the rise in murder rate? Well, those are the politicians, because they're responsible for creating policy that would curb it. They're the ones responsible for enforcing the law. They're the ones responsible for providing social services that would give people alternatives to creating crimes. But that's currently not happening. And when you see this other stat, that gang violence is very prevalent right now, and you have Trudeau doing a gun buyback program that experts all agree will do very little to tackle gang violence, you have a mismatch in priority. It's not the legal gun owners that we need to be worrying about at this point in time, although there are some issues with that. And I am not an advocate of firearms anyways to begin with. I'm simply a reader of the facts here. What we do have to focus on is illegal guns entering our country through our borders. Our friends down south in America are a massive contributor to the problem. And further, there's also a question of Canadian culture and how that's interacting with the current times. Something like the pandemic created harshness for everyone. And you can look at our peers that we cited here in Europe. Given similar conditions, how has some place like Italy achieved something like a 4x less homicide rate? The circumstances are not vastly different there. We suffered through the same pandemic with somewhat similar restrictions. Although Canada did have harsher lockdowns were not foreign in places like that. There are other problems that we have to look at. And to spitball some, obviously the one we just talked about is one, being in close proximity to a country that is gung-ho on guns. Perhaps another one is poverty and rising cost of living. Things that politicians do have to look at. And then perhaps there are things on the culture front. Some things that we have to look at. How we operate when times are tough. The choices that we make in this world. One thing that is often ignored is that people are not robots. Every crime that is committed with intent could have been avoided if the person committing the crime chose to not do it. And that's a simple fact that undergirds all of this. Now, sure, there might be environmental factors that are giving them a proclivity to commit crime. I imagine the person who is struggling to feed their family might have some incentive there. But still, there is a choice in the matter. And further, there is government involvement that could help out, or charity involvement. It's a pot with a lot of factors in it, but one of those factors is you. And with that, what does this whole story mean for someone like you, like an average Canadian? Well, first of all, I don't advise for you to be paranoid and super scared of the situation. As we talked about, the homicide rate sits at about 2 per 100,000, so it's not likely to happen to you. It's actually quite a rare circumstance. And you have to pair that with the knowledge of the fact that crime rates are going up, though. So, don't be paranoid, but do be safe. Be smart. Be aware of your surroundings. Maybe it doesn't make sense to go down sketchy alleyways at night and things like that. Maybe it makes sense for you to improve your social circles and remove people who may be prone to violence and could drag you into that. And finally, there is the notion of self-defense. In Canada, it is quite tricky. So, let's say someone is trying to take your life, or you feel like they are. Canadians do have the right to defend themselves and their property, as long as, first of all, it's a defensive action. That's to say you did not initiate it. And second, it's reasonable under the circumstances. So this is where things do get a little bit tricky. There is typically a standard applied to Canadians, which is proportionate force. So, for example, if someone punches me, I can punch them back. But what I cannot do is maybe break their arm. And if I do that, then the person who started the fight, or the person who may have broken into your house, can actually sue you for the damages there. And that's quite silly, but that actually is the Canadian justice system standard. What they mean by reasonable is extremely reasonable. Reasonable to the point where they're presuming that you have the wherewithal in a combat situation to actually think these things through, which I don't find to be reasonable. And it actually creates an onus and a cost to the victim. It creates an uneven playing field where the victim is tasked with having to work out the facts, even though a perpetrator is right in front of them. And perhaps in the heat of the moment, they extend a little bit too much force, and now they're on the hook. Of course, when I hear the term reasonable, I think, as most people would, that if someone harms you, you defend yourself in whatever means you can, but you don't go crazy overboard. For example, if they're unarmed, you try to subdue them without killing them. But the courts may not be so lenient with you. It is a bit of a backward system that advantages the perpetrator. And further, if you are a weak individual, you're basically screwed in Canada, and I'm sorry to break that to you. There is essentially a rule that any device designed to be used for the purpose of self-defense, or injuring, immobilizing, or otherwise incapacitating somebody is illegal. You can't do things like carry around pepper spray, even. It's illegal in Canada. Any common tool that comes to your head to protect yourself. And once again, this is a rule that favors the perpetrator. And it favors people who are naturally strong. This is the single argument for being armed that I think actually makes sense. And as I said in the beginning, I'm not actually in favor of guns anyways, but to be rational, guns are the only thing that equalizes the playing field between someone who is weak and somebody who's strong. Take somebody who weighs 100 pounds and is 5'2". Are they going to stand any chance in hell against a perpetrator who is trying to kill them, who is 6'2" and 300 pounds? The answer is obviously no. And in Canada, there's nothing that you can do about that, unless you want to break the law yourself. You are entitled to no defensive mechanism. And forget guns, even as I said, pepper spray, bear spray. You cannot have any of that for the purpose of self-defense. And this is where things will get interesting from a policy perspective. If we continue to see rates of crime going up, the Canadian citizenry is going to be really pissed off when they realize they cannot defend themselves legally in this country. The only tool they'll be left to is their fists, and they'll have to be logical as they go out carrying the self-defense order. So things are tricky, and the best course of action always is to avoid violence if you can. Because of these rules in Canada, the best defense actually is being fast. If someone is threatening you, run away. There are very few advantages to you going out and engaging in combat. So with that, I want to see how the government reacts to this. I'm sure they're aware of the trends, even though they don't want to publicly discuss them, and hopefully there are plans to do things to alleviate the issues that we're seeing. One thing's for sure though, all of the abolish the police people are looking quite silly now more than ever. If they really think that's a solution to these problems, well, I'm not sure what to tell them. It is quite interesting to have seen that slogan dissipate and evolve. I am hearing things more along the lines of defund the police now, which also is not the solution here. And with that, it now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share to help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.